Hello and welcome to this week's bonus episode of Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. This week I spoke with Jeremy Lent. He's the author of two books, The Patterning Instinct and more recently The Web of Meaning. His books always come out to rave reviews. He gives this sort of incredible roadmap as to how we got here, what culture and history and science and spirituality, how they've all interacted with each other to get us to where we are today, essentially. And obviously, Jeremy is very concerned about the climate crisis. And he says the best way to combat the climate crisis and to combat the great injustices in the world we live in is to create a new worldview that prioritizes interconnectedness. What does that mean? Well, it's a pretty abstract concept. But essentially, it is understanding that we're all part of an ecosystem. Every single thing on this planet is part of an ecosystem. And then how also systems are part of larger ecosystems, i.e. how our economics affects our ecology or how our energy affects our economics, etc. Jeremy says that we live in a disconnected world and that it is that disconnection, that separation, that alienation that has engendered the meta crisis that we see today. And thus, to combat it, you need to promote interconnectedness. It didn't really click for me at the beginning, I have to say. It sounded a lot like Bali spiritualism. This idea that, if you just change how you think, then you can change the world. And I do push back on Jeremy quite a bit about the sort of the institutionalized problems that we face and the entrenched systems of power that keep the world as it is, the oligarchy, for one. And then there was something towards the end of the episode that he said about moral and emotional interconnectedness, i.e. mapping morals and emotions onto other systems. And that's really kind of blown me away. This idea that interconnectedness doesn't have to be I'm going to use the word, please nobody call me out on this, but like a hippie sense of we are all one and I am the earth and da-da-da-da-da. But rather interconnecting what our cultural ethics can be onto things like our economic system, infusing these things with better values in order to then change them. Dan Fiskus touches on this in his episode. Carl Safina touches on this. I mean, everybody generally on this podcast touches on the fact that our value system needs to be upgraded and we need to infuse how we engage with the world with values. But I found that word interconnectedness, to understand that our morals and our actions are connected, our systems are connected. It's just helped something click. I mean, of course, we live in an increasingly disastrous world when our economic system is exploitative, extractive capitalism, and then that will have a negative feedback loop on degrading the morals of our communities, essentially, certainly degrading the emotions of our communities. And thus, to get back, there needs to be this constant symbiotic dynamic between how are we tackling this from an ethical perspective, from a values perspective, and then how are we using that also to address the systemic changes that need to be made. Interconnectedness is inherently systemic and complex. I do nonetheless worry about reducing a hyper complex and hyper systemic meta crisis into a problem of meaning. Is that an anthropomorphic take on the nature of the crisis? It's certainly a privileged take. I mean, it really only is us who are not at the front line of climate change that can sit and have conversations about meaning when other people's homes are going underwater or being ravaged by fires, or, their land and food is being stolen by despotic leaders. So it's definitely a conversation that can only happen in a certain part of the world. It was the same pushback that I had with Eric Asadurian when he came on the show to talk about Gaianism. And thus, it does make me a little bit uncomfortable. But still, given the systemic nature of the problem, which will require a solution that is also systemic in nature, surely meaning, morals, ethics, values are definitely part of the problem. To me, actually, the real problem when confronting these sort of abstract humanist concepts is time. We're running out of time. We don't have generations to educate children differently. Jeremy says that he thinks that the powers and authorities around the world are crumbling in the sense that young people are waking up to the fact that the powerful are not there for them and the authority needs to be replaced. And yet the complexity of the world that we live in means that it will be extremely difficult to replace those authority figures, perhaps more difficult than previously. We're just not playing by the same rules anymore. We're not even in the same game anymore. This is why Joseph Merz and the Merz Institute are trying to create an ad campaign that bypasses the moral question, because they really firmly believe we just do not have time to educate people properly. I think we've got to do it all. I think you can't bypass the education bit, and you also can't undermine the urgency. And I think all of these actions will be more effective when taken in tandem with one another, and thus creating an ecosystem of solutions. And I think even on a political level, I mean, that's how to kind of outdance the right wing, isn't it? To not go all in on one solution or one ideology, and just keep moving the goalposts and keep trying different things. Because the left, and these, I mean, these are all inherently sort of leftist discussions, aren't they? Collectivism and protecting the planet and all this stuff. But the left has a tendency to eat itself and certainly to disengage from parts of itself that don't conform to the exact mantra or dogma, perhaps even. So this could be a fantastic way as well for the left to evolve into something that is more relevant and thus can perhaps outmaneuver the right wing, because the right wing is such an impenetrable force. You cannot have at them with a battering ram. They will win. If you go one-on-one, like one idea versus another, one policy versus another, one party versus another, I mean, the right wing's just got control right now. Whereas if the left were to actually allow itself to fragment into a system rather than a party, and attack and coalesce and evolve on all sides and offer a myriad of solutions, and thus start to press on lots of different levers at the same time, I mean, politically, that's really exciting. Maybe that's what the left needs to do. And that kind of harks back to Jeremy's point about interconnectedness. Interconnected parties, interconnected politics, factions that are interconnected, people that understand, or groups that understand they have different functions to play as part of a wider goal. A lot of the language around these kinds of conversations can be quite alienating for people. It can come off as a sort of white appropriation of spirituality or of certain spiritualities and cultures. I would urge anybody that has that initial response to try and push beyond it and, think of the etymology of connectedness and what we can actually do, how you can map that onto different systems to increase the complexity and thus perhaps increase our capacity to respond to them and thus increase the resilience, because complex systems are more resilient than simple systems. That's why the modern world is such a headache to deal with when trying to think about a new future. We should be leaning into the complexity, into the connectedness of the ecosystem of solutions that we're going to have to build, not pulling away from it. It's certainly why we shouldn't be focusing all of our energy on one-stop shop solutions like greenhouse gas emissions, net zero. But that's a whole other rant. Thank you very much for joining me on this week's bonus episode of Planet Critical. If you enjoyed it, please do leave a comment and get involved in the conversation. If there's somebody that you want me to interview, also leave it in the comments. I will see it. I will reach out to them and I might even just get them on the show. If you're new to the channel, please do hit subscribe. If you're a long-time listener or even just a new and sudden fan, consider supporting the podcast on Patreon. The support of my subscribers and my patrons enable me to not only invest a lot of time in producing this podcast, but also to continue my independent journalistic investigations, for which I am extremely, extremely grateful. The link is in the description box below if you're interested. Check out the website for more information, planetcritical.com, and I hope this was valuable to you in some way, and I will see you next week.